It's here, we finally got a fast 35mm L series prime lens on the RF mount. And in today's video, I'm going to put it to the test a little bit on some photo shoots, shooting some portraits. And we'll find out what kind of compromises have been made with this lens to get it so small and lightweight. Not only that, but I'll put it up against the budget RF 35mm 1.8 to see if this new lens is really worth it over that. We'll also shoot a little bit of video on this lens because it is quite a video-centric lens. So let's get started. So we've waited long enough for this lens and my expectations are sky high. Did the lens live up to them? Let's start with the good stuff. The rendering of this lens, especially on environmental portraits like this, is just so good. This new 35mm 1.4 has excellent contrast and colours, and here I am shooting on my R6 Mark II. I also noticed immediately, just looking on the back of the camera, that this is a very sharp lens. The in-focus areas of the image are sharp, clear, and have tons of pop, which gives this lens even more background separation as the lens has really nice focus fall off too into that out of focus background. Mid-length shots like this have a really nice 3D look, and just look at that micro contrast in the skin and in the eyes, center frame on this lens. And I mean, step down to f2 and the micro contrast and sharpness is off the charts. This is easily one of the sharpest RF mount lenses, but still it manages to give a nice organic look to portraits in my opinion, and avoid some of that cardboard cutout look that you get with some of these modern digital kind of clinical prime lenses. And just using the lens autofocus was amazing. Again, maybe the best on RF mount, especially on this R6 Mark II, but we will cover that in more detail later. There are flaws with this lens which we'll cover later, but honestly for the most part they have very little bearing on the final image, as I was really happy with how all of these images came out. And I was actually really happy with the quality of the bokeh on this lens. Busy out of focus areas in an image are rendered really smoothly. And wide open, when close like this, you get an almost swirling effect to the background blur, similar to other lenses that I love, like my Canon RF 50mm 1.2 has this kind of rendering too in the out of focus areas. But if we take a closer look at bokeh, we will see that it isn't perfect. It does tame spectral highlights well, as you can see here, but as we get to the extremities of the frame, they are a little bit stretched. And that's probably down to this lens's reliance on digital lens corrections, which we'll cover in a little bit more detail later in the video. Here's an example using a light in my office, how the bokeh is nice and round and pretty smooth center frame, but as we push it out to the extremities of the frame, we get an elongated cat's eye effect. This doesn't happen on all lenses. Really great lenses can maintain that circular bokeh right out to the edges of the frame, but this isn't a unique issue to this 35mm lens. As you can see here on my RF 50mm 1.2, it's actually probably a little bit worse. And I put it down to a lot of these modern RF prime lenses have pretty small front elements. But overall, in the real world, in the final images, in my opinion, bokeh is rendered pretty nicely indeed. And that extends to out of focus elements in the foreground, as you can see here in this example. Now onto some bad news, which is that this lens relies pretty heavily on digital lens corrections. Here's an image with lens corrections applied and it looks fine. Now with them off, you can see really heavy distortion and heavy vignette right into the center frame, which is taking a lot of correcting. Not great news on an L series lens of this cost, especially when you put it side by side with the much cheaper RF 35mm 1.8, which I already thought wasn't very well corrected, but it's actually a lot better when you put it side by side with this new 35mm 1.4. So that's pretty disappointing, but it's still important to remember that at the end of the day, when we looked at the final results, especially for portraits earlier, it really didn't have too much bearing on the final image. Now there's going to be some situations where it does have an effect. For example, in low light situations, you'd think a prime lens like this would be great for shooting at high ISOs thanks to its fast aperture. But when shooting already at high ISOs, those really dark corners are going to have to be lifted a lot to compensate for that vignette, and it's going to introduce even more noise into the edges of your image. So that's worth bearing in mind if you are a low light shooter. And onto chromatic aberration, it's actually pretty well handled on this lens. If we look side by side, it does a much better job compared to the RF 35mm 1.8. But whilst we're talking about the RF 35mm 1.8, let's compare these lenses side by side. We'll compare sharpness along with background blur. And side by side, both lenses wide open. You do see the extra background separation and a smoother focus fall off on the new 1.4 lens. But to be honest, it's not an enormous difference even side by side. But if we punch in to check sharpness, you can see a much more bitingly sharp image on the new RF 35mm 1.4. It is the much sharper lens centrally when wide open. It has more micro contrast, more skin detail, and the eyes are much sharper too. Stepping both these lenses down to f2 shows the new RF 35mm 1.4 lens pull ahead even further, obviously, and this new lens is razor sharp when stepped down. Centrally, it is pretty much perfect from f1.8. Now let's step both lenses down to f2.8 and compare them at this aperture. And at 2.8, I think they compare very well actually in terms of sharpness. It's really hard to tell a difference. And I've always thought that the RF 35mm 1.8 was fantastic at f2.8, but still the new 35mm 1.4 has a little bit more micro contrast, which is apparent in the eyes and the skin detail in my opinion. And for pixel peepers out there, let's check out the corners. And the RF 35mm 1.4 really shows its worth here, as the corners are much sharper and way more contrasty when both lenses are wide open. At 2.8 though, I actually think the RF 35mm 1.8 pulls ahead here in the extremities of the frame. Perhaps this is down to the fact that this cheaper lens is actually a lot better corrected, so there's not all of that stretching in the corners of the image. Not sure. And whilst we're nitpicking and being a bit nerdy, I also noticed that when both of these lenses are stepped down to f2.8, even though they're at the same aperture, the new 35mm 1.4 lens has slightly smoother background blur. It just seems to do a slightly better job of taming these busy, kind of nervous areas. So overall, I continue to be really impressed with the RF 35mm 1.8. This lens is just so good considering the cost, and yet there's a bit of a sharpness increase with this new 35mm lens, but in most images, you're not really gonna tell a difference unless you really zoom in and pixel peep. But don't take my word for it. I have uploaded all of the raw files from that comparison that we've just done to my Dropbox. You can download them for free, take a look at the images and come to your own conclusions. And I've also included a couple of creative portraits on both the R6 Mark II and the Canon R5 for you to take a look at as well. And if these files are helpful to you, then please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. But anyway, let's talk about the video capabilities of this lens. Now this 35mm lens joins Canon's hybrid line of lenses, which essentially is Canon creating lenses with both photo and pro video shooters in mind. And honestly, this lens is fantastic for video. I accidentally shot this in 8K on my R5, so pretty demanding for a lens, and wow, this lens is so sharp, but it still has a really nice organic look to it. The VCM in the title of this lens stands for voice coil motor, And although not a new technology, I think this is the first time we're seeing it on the RF mount. And that pretty much gives this lens near silent autofocus operation. You really do not hear this lens focusing at all. But not only that, but it really mitigates focus breathing too. So focus pulls are super smooth and cinematic looking on this lens. And I feel that this really does add to that cinematic look with this lens, along with that background separation you get, of course, as a complete absence of focus breathing when moving the camera or changing the focus subject gives this a really professional look. And on the subject of autofocus, along with that VCM technology, we also have dual nano USM motors, and this means that this lens is blazing fast in terms of autofocus, and is probably to date the best lens I have used in terms of AF. Focus is just incredibly accurate and fast, especially on my R6 Mark II. Yeah, it was great on the R5 as well, but it really does shine on these newer Canon RF bodies. And tapping on the back of the LCD screen between subjects just shows how rapid this AF is. It is practically instantaneous in swapping between focus points. As I mentioned, this lens is near silent in video mode, and it's very, very quiet in photo mode too, as you can hear. Especially compared to the RF 35mm 1.8, which is quite a bit louder, as you can hear. Another video-centric feature worth mentioning is the smooth aperture ring on the body of the lens, something that you usually only really see on cinema lenses. This has a few uses, but one example is the ability to smoothly open or close your aperture when going from, say, a dimly lit interior to a bright exterior. This aperture ring can be locked by this little button here, so you won't accidentally knock it in photo mode. Not that that's an issue right now, to be honest, because for whatever reason, the aperture ring doesn't function at all in photo mode. So that's disappointing. Hopefully that's fixed soon. Now onto the lens itself. This lens is pretty small and lightweight for such a sharp and fast prime lens. Coming in at 555 grams, the lens design itself actually reminds me a lot of the RF 85mm f2. We've got a 67mm front filter thread to cover that rather small front element, which is actually only slightly bigger than the front element of the RF 35mm 1.8. We've got the usual AF on and off switch, as well as a function button, which is pretty cool to see, and the iris switch that I mentioned earlier, as well as a control ring on the front of the lens. This is also a weather sealed lens too, which you would expect with an L series lens like this. Overall, the lens will feel pretty familiar to you if you own any other RF lenses. It's built from good quality plastics and is generally well built, and it feels really nice on the front of a full frame Canon RF body. It was really comfortable to use over a full day shooting compared to, say, my RF 50mm 1.2. This lens is much smaller and lighter, and it really shows after a long day of shooting. Now, a letdown in terms of build quality when it comes to this lens is that this lens really rattles. I'm guessing it's probably down to that new VCM technology, because this isn't something that I've had to deal with any of my other Canon RF lenses, whether cheap ones or expensive ones. And it also doesn't happen at all when attached to a camera that's powered on. So yeah, not really a big deal, I guess, but it's also not super reassuring, and it's gonna be a noise that you're gonna have to get used to, because even when it's in your backpack and you're just taking steps and walking along, you're gonna hear this noise constantly. So that's a little bit disappointing, and I guess it remains to be seen whether that's going to cause any wear and tear with this lens over the long run, as it just feels like those elements are just basically loose inside the lens when the lens has no power. So my final thoughts on this new lens is, to be honest, yes, this is a flawed lens, but I do still think that it's a great lens. I really value compact and lightweight gear, and I really appreciate camera manufacturers' push to bring us higher quality optics in smaller, lightweight bodies. So overall, I can look past the flaws and the compromises that Canon have made with this lens, because I am so happy with the end result. final images that are coming out of this lens. But does that excuse the kind of compromises that have been made with what is a £1,800 L series lens? I suppose that's up to you. I don't really like this other push by lens manufacturers these days where we're relying so heavily in digital lens corrections in post, especially on prime lenses where these are supposed to be the best corrected lenses straight out of camera. We just seem to not be seeing that as much anymore, especially on the Canon RF mount. To be honest, actually, one thing I'm really not happy with is the rattle. I really think that Canon could have figured something out there to stop it rattling when the lens is powered off. Could it be that these flaws, compromises, and reliance on digital corrections is down to trying to shrink these lenses down as much as possible? Or as photo shooters, is it something we're gonna have to just accept with this hybrid line of lenses where Canon are trying to ultimately make pro video shooters more happy with the design of these lenses? But regardless, this lens is incredibly sharp edge to edge, and in my opinion, it has beautiful rendering, which is unaffected by any of the flaws we've covered in this video. The final images just look so good for portraits, and the autofocus is the best that I've used on pretty much any lens. It is just incredible. So there is a lot to love here, and I am finally happy that we have this lens. We've been waiting so long for it, and as a result, I'm definitely going to be hanging on to mine. But what do you think of this new lens? Was it worth the wait for you, or are you pretty disappointed with the amount of compromises that have been made? Let me know in the comments down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. As always, I hope the video was helpful, and I'll see you all in the next one.